Illinois at dusk. Cornfields bleeding into darkness at the edge of the interstate. A porch light left on in a quiet subdivision. A river town where the street lamps don't reach the water. 10 ordinary places where someone stepped out of frame and never came back. 10 people, 10 Illinois towns. Some found, most never. Pull up the map, lock the door. We're starting in Bolingbrook. If you're new here, subscribe. New cases every week. Sunday, October 28th, 2007. A quiet, Will County subdivision in Bolingbrook, Illinois. The kind of neighborhood where you know your neighbors by their cars, where kids ride bikes to the end of the cul-de-sac and come back for dinner, where the biggest sound on a Sunday morning is a lawnmower 2 streets over. It was that kind of morning, unremarkable, ordinary, the kind of normal that, in retrospect, the people who lived it always describe with a particular helplessness, because nothing about it announced itself as the last morning things would ever be that way. Stacy Peterson was 23 years old. She had dark hair, an easy smile, and 2 young children she was devoted to in the way that people close to her would repeat, over and over. In the weeks and months that followed, not as a platitude dropped into a news segment, but as a specific, unmistakable, load-bearing fact about who she was as a person. She was a mother first. Everything else in her life arranged itself around that. She lived in a house on Pheasant Chase Drive with her husband, Drew Peterson, who was 29 years her senior and a sergeant with the Bolingbrook Police Department. They had been married since 2003. By the fall of 2007, the marriage was fracturing in ways that Stacy had begun to confide to people she trusted. A pastor, family members, close friends. She had spoken about wanting to leave. She had talked about what her life might look like if she did. She had been candid enough and consistent enough that the people she confided in later described those conversations not as vague expressions of frustration, but as a woman actively thinking through what leaving would require and what it would cost her. But none of that had yet crossed into anything formal, anything legal, anything that had visibly changed the outward shape of her daily routine. To anyone watching from the outside, it was still a quiet house on a quiet street in a quiet suburb on an ordinary October Sunday. Her plan that day was simple enough that it barely qualifies as a plan. She was going to meet a friend and help paint a house. That was it. That was the whole day laid out in front of her, a favor for a friend, a can of paint, a few hours of ordinary effort on a clear fall morning. She had made arrangements. There was a time, a place, a person expecting her. The meeting point existed. The plan had a shape to it, the way real plans do, concrete enough that its failure to materialize would be immediately and unmistakably obvious. She was last heard from at approximately 10:15 in the morning. Depending on the account, that moment represents either a brief phone call or a final exchange before she left the house. But in every version, it is the same endpoint. The last confirmed point of contact anyone has ever been able to establish with Stacy Peterson. After 10:15 in the morning on October 28, 2007, she was not anywhere that anyone could find her. The friend waited. The house did not get painted. Here's the critical detail about how that absence was first noticed, and why it matters so much to understanding the shape of everything that followed. It wasn't Drew who raised the alarm. It was Stacy's sister, Cassandra Cales. Mid-afternoon, Cassandra began calling Stacy's phone. It went straight to voicemail, not ringing through and going unanswered in the way a phone does when someone is busy or driving or has their hands full, but straight to voicemail, immediately, the way a phone behaves when it has been powered off entirely or when there is simply nothing left receiving on the other end. Cassandra called again. Same result. She called again after that. She knew her sister. She knew that Stacy, a woman whose entire world orbited around her 2 young kids, who checked in reflexively, who stayed in contact, who was reliably reachable across the ordinary rhythm of a day, would not let a string of calls from family disappear into silence without a word of explanation. There was no text message, no callback, no voicemail returned. By the time evening arrived and the calls had stacked up unanswered, Cassandra was frightened enough to contact police. That fear, it would turn out, was entirely justified. It was the right instinct, reading the right signal just too late to change what had already happened. This is where it stops being normal. When Drew Peterson was asked about his wife's whereabouts, he offered an explanation that struck investigators and Stacy's family alike as startling in both its speed and its specificity. Stacy had run off with another man. That was the answer. Delivered not with visible distress, not with the searching uncertainty of a husband trying to process the fear that something terrible might have happened to someone he loved, but as a clean, ready, fully formed explanation, offered before anyone had formally framed it as a question requiring an answer. A wife and mother of two had simply decided, on an ordinary Sunday morning in a Will County suburb, to abandon her children, her phone, her credit cards, her car, her entire documented life. And the first thing her husband wanted investigators to understand was that she had chosen to leave, willingly, with someone else. No name, no corroborating detail. Just the explanation, delivered with the kind of composure that people who followed this case would spend years trying to make sense of. Police began executing search warrants at the Pheasant Chase Drive home within days of Stacy being reported missing. What they removed was notable in its breadth. Bedding, a collection of 11 firearms, computers, and other electronic equipment. Neighbors watched evidence bags being carried out of a house that had looked, from the outside, exactly like every other house on the street. The searches extended outward from there into the Des Plaines River corridor, into the Illinois and Michigan canal system, into the Lockport waterway network that runs south and west of Bolingbrook, through some of the flattest, most unreadable terrain in northeastern Illinois. Sonar equipment was deployed on stretches of the canal and river system. Dive teams went into water that was cold and dark and disclosed nothing useful. Those searches continued in various forms for years, each new iteration ending the same way it had always ended, without Stacy, without answers, without anything that resolved the silence she had left behind. But the investigation did not stay neatly contained within the boundaries of October 2007. Because this is where the case acquires its most deeply unsettling dimension, the layer beneath the layer. The history that a missing persons case suddenly forced everyone to look at differently. Drew Peterson had been married 4 times. His third wife, Kathleen Savio, had been found dead in a dry bathtub in her Bolingbrook home in March 2004. Her death had been ruled an accidental drowning at the time, a finding that had closed the case, returned a verdict of no foul play, and allowed life in Bolingbrook to continue moving forward as though nothing extraordinary had happened. After Stacy disappeared, Kathleen Savio's body was exhumed. A second autopsy was conducted. The ruling was formally changed from accidental drowning to homicide. In 2012, Drew Peterson was convicted of first-degree murder in Kathleen Savio's death and sentenced to 38 years in prison. That conviction stands. But Stacy Peterson's disappearance, Stacy herself, remains officially listed as a missing person case to this day. No body has ever been recovered. No charge related to her disappearance has ever been filed. Her 2 children grew up without her. Now this is where the case turns dark in the way that lingers longest after you close the file. The ran off with another man explanation carries no supporting evidence, none that has ever been made public, and none that investigators have acknowledged, finding across nearly 2 decades of an open case. There is no financial trail after October 28th. Not a single credit card charge, not a bank withdrawal, not an ATM transaction, a wire transfer, a purchase of any kind on any account linked to Stacy Peterson. There is no phone activity after 10:15 in the morning. There is no record of Stacy Peterson boarding a flight, renting a vehicle, registering at a motel, or making contact with any person in any verifiable, documented way. A woman who, by every account of everyone who knew her well and loved her, would not have left her children vanished without leaving a single footprint in any system that tracks human movement through the world. Not one. In almost 20 years, the searches stretched well beyond the initial weeks of headlines. Cadaver dogs worked stretches of the Illinois and Michigan Canal. Sonar teams returned in subsequent years to sections of the waterway system around Lockport and Channahon, the geography of the search corridor quietly widening as each pass came up empty. Investigators worked tips that arrived in waves after anniversaries, after news cycles, after the Peterson murder trial reignited public attention. Each one was followed up. None of them led anywhere that mattered. The case remains open. Stacy Peterson has never been officially declared dead, though nearly 2 decades have now passed since that October morning. Her sister Cassandra has never stopped pushing for answers, the same woman who first understood, standing somewhere with a phone in her hand on a Sunday afternoon, that something was catastrophically wrong because a call went straight to voicemail, one too many times. What you're left with, when you lay all of it out, is a set of contradictions that resist every innocent explanation at once. A devoted mother who left her children, a woman who departed without a car, without money, without a single documented trace in any direction. A husband convicted of killing a previous wife, never charged in this case. A canal and river system searched for years that has returned nothing. And at the center of all of it, a Sunday morning errand, a can of paint, a friend's house waiting, a plan so ordinary it barely existed as a plan at all, built around a morning that ended at 10:15 and simply never continued. The image that stays with you isn't a crime scene photograph. It's the absence of one. It's a phone going silently, immediately to voicemail, while a sister's worry turned, call by call, into something she already knew in her bones was real before she had the words for it. It's a red jogging suit. It's an errand that never began. It's a porch light on Pheasant Chase Drive that has long since gone dark. The case is open. The canal is quiet. And the next case is worse, because in the same year, in the same kind of town, another mother vanished the same way, a suburban house, a locked daily routine, a door that gave up almost nothing at all. The thing about Plainfield, Illinois, in the spring of 2017, is that it looked almost identical to Bolingbrook. Same Will County geography. Same new-build subdivisions carved out of former farmland. Streets named after the landscape features they replaced, the trees, the meadows, the natural contours of the land that had been graded flat to make room for cul-de-sacs and 2-car garages, and the particular kind of quiet that settles over a suburb at dusk when everyone is inside and the streetlights are just beginning to matter. It was that same world, a different address inside it, but the same world. And in that same world, in that same spring, another woman disappeared from inside her own house and left almost nothing behind to explain how or why or where she had gone. Lisa Stebick was 37 years old. She worked as a food service assistant at a local school, a job that kept her on a schedule, that anchored her to a routine, that placed her inside a community of colleagues and children and daily rhythms that would make an unexplained absence register quickly and unmistakably. She had 2 children of her own, and by April of 2007, she was in the middle of a divorce from her husband, Craig Stebick, who continued to live in the family home at 13,200 Red Star Drive in Plainfield, while the legal proceedings worked their way forward. That arrangement, estranged spouses sharing a house during a contested divorce, navigating the same hallways and the same kitchen and the same front door, while lawyers argued over what each of them was owed, is its own particular kind of sustained pressure. By all accounts, that pressure had been building for some time. Court filings from the divorce proceedings describe disputes over the property, over financial matters, over the everyday friction of 2 people trying to formally separate while still occupying the same physical space. Neither side had yet blinked. Neither had moved out. The house on Red Star Drive held both of them, and the tension between them, inside a neighborhood that otherwise looked like a place where nothing complicated ever happened. Lisa had told people she was eager for the process to be over. She had built a routine around the edges of the situation evenings at the nearby Plainfield North High School gymnasium, walking laps, keeping her own rhythm, maintaining a piece of her life that was undeniably and entirely hers in a domestic situation that had become anything but. Those evening walks were not incidental. They were deliberate. They were the kind of habit that a person builds when the interior of their home has stopped feeling like a place they can breathe freely, a structured exit, a set duration, a known route, a return. Her neighbors knew her. She kept in regular contact with family members. She was, by every measure that matters in these cases, a person embedded in a network of relationships and daily patterns dense enough that an unexplained absence would be immediately and visibly wrong to anyone paying attention. She was not a person who disappeared quietly from the margins of other people's awareness. She was present. She was connected. She was the kind of person whose silence would be noticed, and noticed quickly. April 30th, 2007, was a Monday. By the early evening, Lisa was somewhere on or near Red Star Drive, going about the ordinary business of an ordinary spring night. The details of exactly what she did in those final hours are limited in the public record. What is confirmed is that she was present at the home, that she was seen in the vicinity of the property, and that the last known contact anyone had with her occurred somewhere around 6 p.m. At some point that evening, according to accounts that emerged in the investigation, the children were sent outside on a bike ride. That detail, kids on bikes circling the subdivision in the last light of an April evening while the adults were inside, became one of the small, persistent facts that investigators returned to as they tried to reconstruct the shape of that night. What happened inside that house, while the children were out, has never been clearly established in the public record. What is certain is that when the night ended and the next morning came, Lisa Stebic was gone. Here's the critical detail about how her absence entered the official record. She was not reported missing by anyone in her household. It was a neighbor who made the call. A neighbor who noticed that something about the house on Red Star Drive felt wrong in the way that neighbors sometimes feel before they have specific evidence to point to, before they can explain the exact source of the unease, before the thing they are sensing has a name. The report came in on May 1st, 2007, the day after she was last seen. By the time investigators began formally working the case, they were already operating at a full 24-hour remove from the last confirmed moment anyone had eyes on Lisa Stebic. Every hour that passes in a missing persons case is an hour during which physical evidence degrades, memories of ordinary details begin to blur, and the geography of where a person might have gone quietly and irreversibly expands. 24 hours is not nothing. Reported by a neighbor rather than a family member, after a full day had already elapsed, the investigation was playing catch-up before it had formally begun. What Lisa left behind, or more precisely, what she didn't leave behind, is the detail that has driven this case through years of reopened leads and unanswered questions. She took her purse, she took her cell phone. Those two facts sound, at first pass, like they might indicate a voluntary departure. A woman who gathered the most essential things and walked away from a life she was already in the process of legally ending. But here's what doesn't make sense. From the moment Lisa Stebic vanished on April 30th, 2007, there has been zero activity on her cell phone. Not a single call placed or received. Not a text message sent. Not a data ping from a tower that would place the device in a geographic location and begin to build any kind of trail. The phone went dark at the moment she disappeared and has remained dark ever since. Similarly, her credit and financial accounts have shown no activity, no purchases, no ATM withdrawals, no transactions of any kind that would indicate a living person moving through the world and requiring money to sustain that movement. She took her purse and her phone, and both have been as silent as if they never existed. And she left her car. The vehicle was still in the garage on Red Star Drive when police arrived to begin their work. Think about that combination for a moment. A woman who took her purse and her phone but left her car in a Will County suburb where driving is not optional, where the nearest store, the nearest gym, the nearest anything requires a vehicle to reach with any kind of practicality, and who never once touched either the phone or the financial accounts again after that evening. The math of that combination does not resolve into anything that looks like a planned, voluntary departure. It resolves into something else entirely, and everyone involved in this investigation has understood that from the beginning. A person building a new life somewhere else needs money. They need their phone. They need transportation. Lisa Stebic took two of those three things and left the most critical one behind, then used neither of the two she carried. This is where it stops being normal in the specific and suffocating way it does in cases like this. The FBI became involved. Investigators from multiple agencies examined the property at Red Star Drive and the surrounding areas. Craig Stebic was publicly named as a person of interest, a designation that stopped short of formal accusation but made unambiguously clear the direction of investigative focus. He declined to cooperate with investigators beyond what was legally required of him. He stopped granting media interviews. He retained an attorney and exercised rights that the law entirely permits, and which investigators working a missing persons case with limited physical evidence must simply account for while continuing to search for another way forward. The gym routine Lisa had maintained those evening laps at Plainfield North, that deliberate carving out of personal space and physical discipline inside a difficult and deteriorating home situation, ended on April 30th and has never been explained by anything that anyone has found in the years since. What happened to the investigation in the months and years that followed contains one of the stranger institutional facts attached to this case. Resources and media attention that might otherwise have sustained momentum on the Stebic disappearance were, to a meaningful degree, diverted, partly by the sheer volume of active cases demanding investigative attention in Will County, and partly by the gravitational pull of another disappearing woman from another subdivision just a few miles away. When Stacy Peterson vanished from Bolingbrook in October 2007, that case absorbed enormous quantities of investigative bandwidth, media coverage, and public focus. The two cases were geographically proximate, thematically similar, and separated by only 6 months, same county, same year, same suffocating shape to the absence each woman left behind, but they were two separate women and two separate cases. And the attention directed toward one was, at some practical level, attention not being directed toward the other. Whether that reallocation meaningfully impaired progress on the Stebic investigation is something no official has ever formally addressed. What is simply true is that Lisa Stebic's case never received the same sustained national profile, and the search for her did not generate the same volume of durable public engagement across the years that followed. 2 women, 6 months apart, one county and the second one faded from the national conversation in ways the first one never quite did. No body has ever been recovered. No location has ever been confirmed as the place Lisa Stebic went after the evening of April 30th. Craig Stebic was never charged in connection with her disappearance. The case is officially listed as unsolved. The children she left behind, the same kids who had been riding bikes through the neighborhood on that spring evening, circling the subdivision in the last of the April light, while something irrevocable was happening inside that house, grew up without their mother and without an explanation for why she was gone. The garage where her car sat undisturbed when investigators first arrived eventually became just a garage again. The phone she carried out of the house that night became a number that connected to nothing. A purse and a phone that went permanently dark. A car that never moved. A neighbor who had to make the call that no one inside the household made. That is what April 30th, 2007 left behind in Plainfield, Illinois. A set of objects pointing in opposite directions, and a silence so thorough and so complete that it became its own kind of statement, just not one that anyone has yet been able to read clearly enough to act on. The gym bag, the car in the garage, the phone that never lit up again. The case is open. And the next one waited 42 years to give up its first real clue, and even then, what came up from the water raised more questions than it put to rest. There is a specific kind of dread that attaches to cases that stay cold for decades, not the sharp, immediate terror of a fresh disappearance, but something slower and more corrosive. The knowledge that a person has been missing for so long, that the world has reorganized itself entirely around their absence, that the people who loved them have aged, some have died, and the case file has gathered dust in a cabinet somewhere, while ordinary life continued on both sides of the river. Karen Sheepers disappeared in 1983. For 42 years, she was simply gone, a young woman, a yellow car, a familiar route home, and then nothing. And then, in the early months of 2025, something came up from the Fox River that changed the shape of what everyone thought they knew. It didn't close the case. It didn't answer the hardest questions, but it proved, finally, that the river had been holding a secret for 4 decades, and that the secret had been there the entire time, in the water, beneath the surface of a landscape that thousands of people had crossed and driven past and lived beside without knowing what the river floor was keeping from them. Karen Sheepers was 23 years old in the spring of 1983. She worked at a bank, a job that carried its own particular rhythm of weekday routine and professional reliability, the kind of work that places you inside a structured community of colleagues and deadlines and daily accountability. She was young, she was employed, She had a social life that included the kind of ordinary celebration that belongs to the early years of a working adult's life. On the night of April 15th, moving into the early hours of April 16th, 1983, she was at P.M. Bentley's bar in Carpentersville, Illinois, celebrating with co-workers. The occasion was a promotion. It was the kind of night that deserves to be remembered as simply good, a milestone, a round of drinks, a group of people who worked together marking something that had gone right in one of their lives. The bar was in Carpentersville, along the Fox River corridor, in the kind of small city landscape that populates the collar counties northwest of Chicago, not remote, not particularly isolated, a place with roads and neighborhoods, and the reasonable expectation that a short drive home at the end of a celebration night was exactly that, a short drive home, unremarkable. The kind of trip a person makes without thinking about it, because they have made it 100 times before and nothing has ever happened. Karen drove a 1980 Toyota Celica. The color was canary yellow with red accent stripes, a distinctive car, the kind of vehicle that registers in memory precisely because it announces itself. A bright yellow Celica with red stripes is not invisible. It does not blend into a parking lot or disappear against the gray of a pre-dawn road. It is, by any honest accounting, the kind of car that people notice and remember, the kind of car that would stand out along a two-lane road at night the way few vehicles would. It is not the car you lose. It is not the car that slips past you unremarked. It is the car that someone, somewhere, should have been able to point to and say, "Yes, I saw that. I know exactly where it went." She was reportedly the last person from her group to leave the bar. That single fact, last to leave, has sat at the center of this case for more than 4 decades. Because it means that whatever happened to Karen Scheepers happened after everyone else she had been with that night had already gone home and closed their front doors and moved on to the ordinary business of a late night. There were no witnesses from her group who could account for what she encountered once she stepped out of P.M. Bentley's into the dark of an April night in Carpentersville. The last anyone from that celebration saw of her was inside the bar. What happened in the parking lot, on the road, between the bar and wherever she was going, that entire territory has been blank for 42 years. She was last seen wearing a tan, hooded corduroy jacket and a Wittenauer brand watch. Those details preserved in missing persons documentation with the kind of specificity that comes from people desperate to give investigators every possible tool to find a match, to generate a sighting, to close the gap between the last moment she was seen and the first moment she should have been somewhere and wasn't, became part of the long paper trail of a case that refused to resolve. A corduroy jacket, a specific watch brand, details small enough that you could almost overlook them, and specific enough that the people who recorded them understood that specificity was the only weapon available to them once the trail went cold. She never arrived home. She never called. The yellow Celica with the red stripes, which should have been impossible to miss parked on any street in any neighborhood in the Fox River Valley, was not found where it should have been found. For a period after she disappeared, her father, an airline pilot, a man with both the means and the desperate need to do something active in the face of institutional limits, rented a small plane and flew low over the area, scanning the landscape below for a flash of canary yellow that might tell him where his daughter had gone. He flew over roads and riverbanks and parking areas and stretches of suburban and rural terrain in the Fox River corridor. Think about what that search must have looked like from inside that cockpit, a father at the controls, eyes moving across the ground below, looking for a color bright enough that it should have been visible from altitude, knowing that if he could just see it, he would know where to go next. He found nothing. The car was not visible from the air. Karen was not visible from the air. Whatever had happened to them had already moved beyond the reach of what a father in a rented plane could find by looking. The river was below him the entire time, and the river did not show him what it was holding. Here's the critical detail that reframes the entire 42-year gap. At some point, the precise timeline is part of what investigators have been working to reconstruct. The yellow Toyota Celica went into the Fox River. Not on a busy stretch of highway where someone would have seen it happen. Not at a boat launch in broad daylight. Somewhere along the Fox River corridor where a car could enter the water and settle into the riverbed and remain there, undiscovered. Through 4 decades of seasonal flooding and drought cycles, and the general passage of time, the river kept it. In 2022, there was a moment that should have changed everything. A moment when the car was reportedly spotted in the Fox River, when divers or investigators came close enough to make a tentative identification of a submerged vehicle. But the vehicle was misidentified as a different type. The conclusion was wrong. The moment passed. The Celica stayed in the water. The case stayed cold. And somewhere in the Fox River, 42 years of silt and current continued to accumulate over a canary yellow car that a father had once flown over in a rented plane and could not find because it was already 30 feet beneath the surface by the time he was searching. The break, when it finally came, arrived in March of 2025. Chaos Divers, a specialized dive team assisting the Elgin Police Department's cold case unit, recovered Karen Scheepers' 1980 Toyota Celica from the Fox River. The car came up. After 42 years underwater, after one missed identification 3 years prior, after decades of a case file that had produced no physical evidence of any kind pointing to where she had gone, the car was there. It had been there the entire time. The river had been holding it within the geographic range of a short drive from that bar in Carpentersville, along a route that Karen Scheepers would have known well. On a night in April 1983, when she left a celebration and drove into a darkness that swallowed her completely, the discovery of the vehicle was confirmed by the Elgin Police Department and reported by major outlets. Her family, the ones still living, the ones who had carried this unanswered question across 4 decades of ordinary life that had moved forward without resolution, learned in 2025 that the river had been holding that answer all along, close enough that the people searching for her had nearly found it 3 years earlier and come away with the wrong answer. But here is what doesn't make sense. Or rather, here is where the discovery of the car opens up a space that remains unfilled. Recovering the vehicle did not immediately resolve the central question. How did that car end up in the Fox River? And what happened to Karen Scheepers? Investigators confirmed they were still working to determine how the vehicle came to be submerged and whether foul play was involved. Those 2 questions, how and whether, are not small questions. They are the questions. The Fox River does not swallow cars on its own. A canary yellow Toyota Celica does not submarine itself into moving water on an April night without some combination of circumstances that require explanation. Whether that explanation involves an accident on a dark stretch of riverbank road where the shoulder drops steeply toward the water, a vehicle that left the pavement under conditions that could have been caused by any number of factors, or something more deliberate and more terrible, that determination is still being made. The car has been recovered. Karen Scheepers has not. Whether her remains are somewhere in the river system, somewhere in the surrounding terrain, or somewhere else entirely remains, as of this writing, officially unknown. Now this is where the case turns dark in the particular way that decades cold cases do, when a physical discovery arrives without the full explanation everyone has been waiting for. Because the 42-year gap itself becomes part of the horror. A missed identification in 2022 means the car sat there for 3 more years after someone came close enough to almost find it. A father who flew over the river corridor in a small plane and didn't see it because it was already beneath the surface before the search began. A watch, a corduroy jacket, a set of red accent stripes on a bright yellow car, all of them preserved in documentation for 4 decades because the people who loved Karen Scheepers refused to let the details dissolve, refused to stop believing that specificity mattered, that the right combination of facts in front of the right eyes at the right moment might still produce something. And in a way, they were right. The case did produce something in March 2025. It just didn't produce everything, not yet. The river gave back the car. The river has not yet given back Karen. The Fox River runs through Kane County the way it has for centuries, indifferent to the cases built along its banks, indifferent to the questions that accumulate in the files of cold case units in Riverside police departments. It does not give things back easily or completely. When it does return something, it does so on its own timeline, in its own way, with its own incompleteness. A yellow car with red stripes came up from the riverbed after 42 years, and the people working the case looked at what the river had returned and understood that the river had not yet returned everything. A canary yellow car under the Fox River for 42 years. passed over once by the people who were looking for it, and a promotion that deserved a better night. A corduroy jacket, a Wittenauer watch, still unaccounted for, still somewhere in the geography of that April darkness, still waiting. If you're into cases like this, hit subscribe. We go deep on every one. The next case broke down in broad daylight on one of the busiest interstates in central Illinois, with cars passing the whole time, and no one who drove past that afternoon understood what they were witnessing until it was already far, far too late. There is a particular vulnerability to a highway breakdown that most people understand instinctively, even if they have never had to think about it directly. The moment your car stops working on an interstate shoulder, you are immediately outside the protective geometry of normal life. You are beside the road instead of on it. You are stationary while everything else is moving. You are alone in a way that has a specific quality visible to everyone passing, accessible to anyone who decides to stop, with no neighbors to call, no storefront to step into, no crowd to dissolve into if something goes wrong. The interstate shoulder is one of the most exposed places a person can find themselves in the middle of an ordinary day. Most of the time, nothing happens. A tow truck comes. A state trooper pulls up behind, with lights flashing. A family member drives out to help. The car gets fixed or towed and life resumes. Most of the time. But on August 23rd, 1992, on Interstate 80 near mile marker 83 in central Illinois, a 21-year-old woman's car broke down on that exposed shoulder, and the tow truck came too late to matter, and the state trooper who eventually arrived found only the car, ticketed and empty, parked on the side of the road as though its driver had simply stepped away for a moment and would be right back. Tammy Zywicki was 21 years old. She was a student at Grinnell College in Iowa, a school with a strong academic reputation and a tight community, the kind of place where students know each other by name, where a failure to show up registers almost immediately in the fabric of daily campus life. Tammy was a photographer and a soccer player. She was driving back to Grinnell to begin a new school year, a trip she had made before, a route that was familiar enough not to require particular attention or anxiety, the kind of long drive that a college student manages alone without drama, because it is simply the unremarkable geography between home and school, measured in hours and highway exits and gas station stops, not in any particular danger. She had left home and was heading west on Interstate 80, somewhere in the flat, wide open expanse of central Illinois, where the land runs to the horizon in every direction, and the interstate cuts through it in a straight line that seems to have no beginning and no end. At some point between 3:10 and 4 in the afternoon of August 23rd, her car, a Pontiac, developed a problem that forced her to pull over at mile marker 83, near LaSalle, Illinois. The afternoon was still bright. Traffic was moving. She was not hidden. She was not in darkness. She was on a busy interstate in the middle of a weekday afternoon, and none of that protected her. Here's the critical detail that has driven this investigation through 3 decades of leads and dead ends and renewed efforts. Witnesses. Multiple people driving past that stretch of Interstate 80 that afternoon saw something that, in retrospect, they understood to be significant, though in the moment. It may have looked like nothing more than an ordinary roadside situation. A vehicle with mechanical trouble and another vehicle stopped nearby to help. What they saw, or what accounts from that period describe, was a tractor trailer parked in proximity to Tammy's Pontiac on the shoulder. The truck was described as having a faded, rusty orange stripe along its side. The driver seen in connection with this vehicle was described as a white male, approximately 35 to 40 years old, over 6 feet tall, with dark, bushy hair. That description, specific enough to be useful, general enough to apply to thousands of men driving commercial trucks on Midwestern interstates in 1992, became the central physical anchor of an investigation that has never produced a confirmed suspect. Another account describes a truck driver reporting that he saw Tammy get into a gray Chevrolet Celebrity, that she told him her car had overheated, and that she was advised to go to a truck stop in LaSalle. Whether that account is accurate, whether the vehicle described as a Celebrity and the tractor trailer with the orange stripe represent the same moment or different moments in a sequence of events on that shoulder, or whether some details in the public record represent confusion or misremembering that accumulated over time? These are questions that investigators have worked through repeatedly without reaching conclusions. They have been prepared to make public in any definitive way. What the Illinois State Police trooper found when they arrived at that stretch of Interstate 80 was Tammy's Pontiac, parked on the shoulder, unlocked and empty. No Tammy. No sign of where she had gone or with whom. The car was ticketed, the ordinary bureaucratic response to a vehicle left on an interstate shoulder without explanation, and eventually towed. It was a response calibrated to a common situation, an abandoned vehicle on a busy highway. The kind of thing that happens dozens of times a day across the state for entirely ordinary reasons. The machinery of routine institutional response moved forward as it was designed to do, and Tammy Zywicki was not inside it. She had been removed from the situation that the trooper's response was designed to address, by something the response protocol had no mechanism to detect. 9 days passed. Now this is where the case turns dark. 9 days after Tammy Zywicki's car was found ticketed and empty on the shoulder of Interstate 80 in central Illinois, her body was discovered approximately 500 miles away along Interstate 44 in rural Lawrence County, Missouri. She had been wrapped in a blanket that was sealed with duct tape. The physical evidence of how she was transported to that location, across 500 miles of interstate highway, speaks to a level of planning and mobility that pointed investigators immediately and consistently toward the world of long-haul trucking. The Interstate 80 corridor through central Illinois was, in 1992 as it is now, one of the primary commercial freight routes across the country. Thousands of semi-trucks moved through that stretch every single day. A driver working that corridor would have had both the means to stop at that mile marker, 83 shoulder, and the means to transport a victim south and west across hundreds of miles of interstate in the ordinary course of a commercial driving route, with the movement of the vehicle itself unremarkable within the standard geography of freight logistics. This is where it stops being normal in the investigative sense, where the sheer scale of the suspect pool becomes its own obstruction. Investigators in the years following Tammy's death looked at truck drivers. They subpoenaed logs. They traced routes. They identified drivers whose documented movements placed them in the Interstate 80 corridor on August 23, 1992, and worked through the list with the systematic effort that a case with this much invested attention demands. Several individuals were looked at closely enough that their names entered the public record as persons of interest at various points across the 3 decades since. None of those investigations produced an arrest. DNA evidence was developed from physical material recovered during the investigation, evidence that has been described in news coverage as central to the eventual resolution of the case, if and when a viable suspect is identified for. Comparison. That DNA has not produced a match in any of the publicly reported rounds of testing and database comparison that have occurred over the years. The evidence exists. The comparison has not yet found the person it belongs to. But here's what doesn't make sense when you sit with the full picture, or rather, here is what is most difficult to reconcile. Tammy Zywicki vanished in broad daylight, on a busy interstate, in a situation where multiple people passed, and some of them saw pieces of what was happening. The interstate shoulder is exposed precisely in both directions. It offers no cover, but it also offers no reliable witnesses, because everyone driving past is moving at highway speed, with their own destination and their own focus, catching fragments of a scene in their peripheral vision without stopping to record or report. Someone, or more than one person, saw a tractor trailer near her car. Someone saw a gray sedan. Those descriptions entered the public record and have been worked against for 30 years without producing a convergent, confirmed account of exactly what happened in that window between 3:10 and 4 in the afternoon on August 23rd. The witnesses who existed in that moment drove away from it before they understood what they had seen. And by the time they understood, the moment was 500 miles and 9 days behind them. Her personal belongings were missing when her body was found. Her camera, the one she carried as a photographer, a tool that was part of how she moved through the world and understood it, was gone. A watch that played the melody of "Raindrops Keep Fallin' on My Head" was gone. A soccer patch. Small objects that had no monetary value to whoever took them, but that represented the specific, irreplaceable texture of a particular person's life. Those items have never been recovered. They are listed in case documentation, alongside the physical description of the truck and the driver, with dark bushy hair and the faded orange stripe details that were specific enough to be recorded and have not been specific enough, in 30 years of effort, to produce a prosecution. The LaSalle County area, the stretch of Interstate 80 through central Illinois, the truck stop at LaSalle, where Tammy may or may not have been advised to go, these locations have been re-examined across multiple investigative renewals. The case has been periodically revived by new DNA technology, new database comparisons, new appeals from the Zywicki family, and from investigators who have not closed the file. The Illinois State Police have maintained it as an active investigation. The family has maintained pressure. None of it has yet produced the arrest that would transform a 30-year-old cold case into a prosecution and, eventually, something that resembles accountability. What you are left with, in the end, is a stretch of flat, central Illinois interstate, a mile marker, and a window of less than an hour on a bright August afternoon when something irreversible happened in a place where dozens of people drove past and none of them stopped in time. A Pontiac, ticketed and towed. A blanket sealed with duct tape in a Missouri field, 500 miles from mile marker 83. A camera that should have come home. A watch that played a song somewhere and then went permanently silent. The interstate is still there. The shoulder is still exposed. The file is still open. And the next one also ended with an abandoned car, but in a town, not on a highway. With a geographic displacement between where a woman was last seen and where her vehicle was found that has never been explained by anything, investigators have been able to establish in the public record. Beecher, Illinois sits in the far southern reach of the Chicago suburbs, in the kind of geography that the city's sprawl hasn't quite finished, absorbing a place where subdivisions thin out into farmland without a clean boundary between them, where the roads that connect one small community to the next run through stretches of flat agricultural terrain that offers very little cover and very little witness. It is not remote in the way that rural Wisconsin or downstate farm country is remote, but it carries its own variety of isolation, the isolation of a place that exists just beyond the edge of everything, close enough to the metropolitan grid to feel connected, far enough from it that the ordinary density of urban life, the foot traffic and surveillance cameras and witnesses that accumulate in a city, simply aren't present. On an afternoon in early October 1990, in the area around Goodenow Road in Beecher, a 28-year-old woman was seen for the last time, driving a red hatchback that should have been traceable and wasn't, heading towards something that has never been established, on an ordinary weekday afternoon that ended in a silence that has lasted more than 30 years. Robin Renea Abrams was 28 years old when she disappeared. The official missing persons report was filed on October 4, 1990, and records indicate she was last seen at approximately 4 in the afternoon in the area of Goodenow Road in Beecher, a flat, largely rural road that runs through the farmland south of the main Beecher township, the kind of road where traffic is light enough that a passing vehicle is an event worth noticing, where the sight of a car stopped on the shoulder or turning into a driveway registers in the peripheral awareness of anyone who happens to be there. She was driving a red 1989 Dodge Daytona hatchback, a car distinctive enough in both color and body style that it should have been easy to track, the kind of vehicle that doesn't dissolve into the background of a rural road. She was believed to be wearing a black leather jacket, a white knit pullover, black patent leather shoes, and a gold pinky ring, possibly carrying a light beige patterned clutch. Those details, the specific textures and colors of what she had on, the small distinctive accessories exist in the public record because someone sat down with people who knew Robin Abrams and asked them to remember everything, to pull every detail out of memory and commit it to paper, because those details were all that was left to work with once the afternoon of October 4th had passed without her returning. Here's the critical detail that gives this case its particular geographic dissonance. Robin Abrams was last seen in Beecher, in the far southern reaches of Will County, on a rural road in the middle of the afternoon. Her red Dodge Daytona was later recovered in Harvey, Illinois. Harvey sits approximately 35 miles north of Beecher, a Cook County municipality that occupies a very different place in the suburban geography of the Chicago metropolitan area. Where Beecher is farmland and sparse roads and a small-town grid, Harvey is dense, urban, suburban terrain, a community with its own distinct character and its own entirely different physical environment. Those two places, Beecher and Harvey, do not belong to the same natural landscape or the same logical geography for a single vehicle trip. There is no ordinary errand that begins in Beecher at 4 in the afternoon and deposits a car in Harvey without the driver either being present in Harvey or having been removed from the vehicle at some point along the 35-mile route between them. The car traveled. Robin Abrams did not travel with it, or if she did not remain with it at its destination. The car arrived in Harvey. Robin did not. This is where it stops being normal in the specific and deeply unsettling way that the displacement of a vehicle tells a story about what likely happened to its driver, without providing any of the details necessary to confirm that story or act on it. A car found 35 miles from where its driver was last seen, in a different county, in a different kind of community, with no explanation for how it got there that has ever been established in the public record. That car is not there by accident. Vehicles do not relocate themselves. The Dodge Daytona was driven from somewhere to Harvey, or it was transported there. And the person who drove it or transported it to Harvey was not Robin Abrams in any situation that ended with her walking away and living a life somewhere, because Robin Abrams has not been found. No trace of her has been confirmed in the public record since October 4th, 1990. No financial activity, no sightings that have been verified, no resolution of any kind in more than 3 decades. The public record on this case is notably sparse beyond the core confirmed facts, and that sparseness is itself a kind of information, a reflection of a case that received limited public profile in the years following her disappearance, that didn't generate the sustained media attention that might have produced additional witnesses or tips, that moved through the system as a missing persons case in the early 1990s, when investigative resources and public databases were less developed than they are today. What the Illinois State Police Zone 3 records preserve is the outline: a woman, a date, a road, a detailed clothing description, a red car found in a different city. The space between those facts, what happened in Beecher, how the car came to be in Harvey, what the intervening 35 miles of suburban and rural terrain between those two places contains, in terms of the story of what happened to Robin Abrams, is officially unknown. Investigators have not publicly disclosed leads or persons of interest in a way that has entered the available record. The case does not have the kind of public narrative infrastructure that some other missing persons cases develop over time: a documentary, a podcast revival, a family spokesperson who has remained in sustained contact with media. It exists in the public domain as a set of confirmed facts and an open file. But here's what doesn't make sense about leaving this case without the weight it deserves. The displacement of that vehicle is not a small detail. In cases where a missing persons vehicle is found in a different location from where they were last seen, with no explanation for the movement and no trace of the owner at the destination, that gap is almost always treated by investigators as a significant indicator about the nature of the disappearance. A car moved by its owner under ordinary circumstances leaves traces, surveillance footage, witness accounts, transaction records from wherever the journey took them. Some combination of evidence that builds a picture of voluntary movement from one place to another. A car moved by someone other than its owner, or moved with an owner who had been harmed, leaves a different kind of trace, or leaves almost none at all. The Dodge Daytona in Harvey left almost none. 35 miles north of where Robin Abrams was last seen, parked in Cook County, its driver gone, and no documented explanation for any of it. What remains, more than 30 years later, is what the ISP Bulletin preserves: a woman in a black leather jacket and a gold pinky ring, last seen on a rural road south of Beecher on an October afternoon, in a red car that ended up 35 miles away without her. The farmland around Goodenow Road has not changed dramatically in the decades since. The route between Beecher and Harvey runs through a landscape that was, in 1990, as it is now, a long corridor of south suburban terrain. light industrial zones and residential streets, and flat road geometry that offers a driver plenty of opportunity to stop without being seen. Whatever happened along that corridor on the afternoon of October 4th, 1990, has not yet been publicly resolved. The red hatchback is the only physical evidence that has entered the record, and even the red hatchback has been silent since it was recovered. A red car in Harvey with no driver, a rural road in Beecher with no witnesses, and the 35 miles between them still unexplained. The case is open. Robin Abrams has not been found. Hit subscribe if you want to go deeper on cases like this. We cover them every week. Now the next case takes us to the Illinois River, not to a highway or a rural road, but to a 4-mile walk between two river towns on a September night in 2010, along a route that runs beside water the whole way, through terrain dark enough and isolated enough that a person could disappear into it without anyone realizing for weeks that they were gone. Karen McGovern was 53 years old, and she was walking home from a party. That is how it starts, simply, ordinarily, with a decision that thousands of people make on thousands of nights, without anything going wrong. Marseilles, Illinois, is a small river town on the Illinois River, about 8 miles east of Ottawa in LaSalle County. In the broad agricultural corridor of north-central Illinois, where the river runs between bluffs, and the towns that grew up along it are old enough to have their own particular texture, brick storefronts, river bars, the kind of community where most people know each other by name, and a face at a party is a recognizable face. The party she left was at a house in the 600 block of East Bluff Street. Bluff Street running, as its name suggests, along the elevated terrain above the river. The kind of address that places you at the edge of the town's geography, at the point where the built environment gives way to the natural one. Her home was in Seneca, 4 miles to the east along the river. 4 miles is a long walk, especially at night, but it is not an impossible one along Route 6, which follows the river, or along the Illinois and Michigan Canal Trail, which runs parallel to the river through that stretch of LaSalle County. A long, flat, tree-lined path that connects Marseilles and Seneca through terrain that is beautiful in daylight and profoundly dark after midnight. September 26, 2010. Karen McGovern left the party on East Bluff Street at some point in the evening and began, or was presumed to have begun, the 4-mile journey home. She was seen walking away from the party in the direction that would take her toward Seneca, and then she was simply not in Seneca. She did not arrive at the home she was heading toward. She did not call. She did not make contact with anyone who has come forward with a confirmed account of seeing her after she walked away from that party. The 4 miles between Marseilles and Seneca, along a river road or a canal trail or some combination of both, through terrain that offers darkness and isolation in roughly equal measure, swallowed her completely. Not immediately and dramatically, in a way that generated urgent response. Slowly, quietly, in a way that wasn't formally acknowledged for weeks. Here's the critical detail about the timeline that hampered everything that followed. Karen McGovern was not reported missing until November 4th, 2010, more than 5 weeks after she was last seen walking away from that party in Marseilles. 5 weeks. In a missing persons investigation, time is the single most consequential variable in whether physical evidence survives, whether witnesses retain accurate memories of what they observed, whether surveillance footage still exists, whether the landscape itself still holds any trace of what occurred. 5 weeks is not a delay measured in hours or days that might be explained by confusion about whether someone had traveled somewhere voluntarily. 5 weeks is a deliberate or catastrophic failure of the early warning mechanisms that are supposed to catch a person's disappearance before the trail goes cold. By the time anyone formally told investigators that Karen McGovern had not been seen since September 26th, it was November, and the September landscape along the Illinois River had moved through a full month of weather and seasonal change and ordinary human activity that had overwritten whatever traces might have remained. The 5-week reporting delay in Karen McGovern's case is not a bureaucratic footnote. It is the structural wound at the center of the investigation, the gap through which whatever physical evidence the September landscape might have preserved simply drained away before anyone with authority to look for it knew they should be looking. Think about what 5 weeks means in practical terms. along a river corridor in central Illinois. The Illinois and Michigan Canal Trail between Marseilles and Seneca runs through terrain that changes with the seasons. Leaves fall, water levels shift, ground conditions alter, and the ordinary foot traffic of hikers and cyclists and local residents moves through the landscape continuously, overwriting the micro-evidence that a forensic investigation depends on. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, tire tracks on a soft shoulder, the small physical grammar of what happened on a specific night, all of it subject to erasure by nothing more dramatic than 5 weeks of ordinary October weather in northern Illinois. By November 4th, when someone finally made the call that placed Karen McGovern's disappearance in the formal record, the September night she vanished had been buried under a month of everything that follows September in the Illinois River Valley. It was as if the case began in midwinter, reaching back toward a starting point it could no longer touch. The question of who waited 5 weeks and why sits at the uncomfortable center of this case in a way that investigators have acknowledged without fully resolving in the public record. Karen McGovern had a troubled marriage. That fact is documented. It is part of the investigative context that Illinois State Police Zone 3 has worked within. And it is not incidental to understanding why a 53-year-old woman could be absent from her life for more than a month before the formal machinery of a missing persons investigation was set in motion. Her husband, investigators have noted publicly, has not cooperated with the investigation into his wife's disappearance. That non-cooperation is, again, a legal right. A person cannot be compelled to speak to investigators without the kind of formal legal mechanism that requires evidence sufficient to obtain a warrant or compel testimony, and the absence of cooperation is not itself evidence of guilt in a legal sense. But in the practical geography of a missing persons investigation, a non-cooperative spouse in a troubled marriage, combined with a 5-week reporting delay, creates an investigative landscape that is shaped by absence in multiple directions simultaneously. The person who might know the most is not talking. The time during which the physical environment might have spoken has passed. What remains is a case built almost entirely on the outline of what is known, rather than the substance of what happened. Here's what doesn't make sense when you lay out the confirmed facts in sequence. Karen McGovern's family has noted that she always kept in contact with her mother. Not occasionally, not when she remembered always. It was a consistent, documented pattern of behavior, the kind of routine that people who are close to their parents maintain reflexively, and whose absence registers immediately and unmistakably to the person on the other end of those calls. If Karen kept in regular contact with her mother, the silence that began after September 26th should have been alarming within days, not weeks. The architecture of that relationship, a daughter who called her mother consistently, as a matter of habit, was designed to catch exactly this kind of disappearance early. That it did not catch it early, that the formal report came 5 weeks after the last sighting, rather than 5 days, is something that has never been fully explained in the public record. Whatever happened in the space between Karen's family's awareness that she was gone and the moment someone filed an official report, that interval, and the decisions that shaped it, remain part of the unresolved context surrounding this case. The route she was most likely walking that night runs through terrain that carries its own particular character after dark. Route 6 along the Illinois River Valley is a 2-lane highway connecting the river towns of LaSalle County, not heavily trafficked at night, but not deserted either. The Illinois and Michigan Canal Trail, if that was her route, is a different matter entirely. The I&M Canal Trail through that stretch of LaSalle County is one of the genuinely isolated pieces of public land in northern Illinois, a long, flat, tree-lined corridor running parallel to the river, beautiful in daylight, in the way that old canal infrastructure becomes beautiful when the industrial purpose drains away and nature reclaims the margins, but profoundly dark and quiet on a September night after the last cyclist has gone home and the nearest town is a mile or two behind or ahead. A person walking that trail alone after midnight would be moving through a landscape where the nearest potential witness is separated by enough distance and enough darkness that whatever happened there would leave its mark only in the physical environment, and the physical environment had 5 weeks to forget. The Illinois State Police have maintained this as an active investigation. The case is listed as open. Karen McGovern has not been found. No body has been recovered. No physical evidence linked to her disappearance has been publicly disclosed, and no charges have been filed in connection with her disappearance. The 4 miles between East Bluff Street in Marseilles and her home in Seneca remain the central unsolved geography of this case, a short distance in any ordinary context, and in this context, an unbridgeable gap that has resisted 35 years of investigative effort. The river runs through that corridor as it always has, indifferent to what the canal trail beside it may have witnessed on a September night in 2010. The towns of Marseilles and Seneca continue their ordinary river-town existence on either side of a 4-mile stretch of road and trail that holds, somewhere in its geography, an answer that has not yet surfaced. A dark stretch of the I&M Canal Trail between two towns, and a woman who never made the 4 miles home. The case is open. The river keeps moving. The next case made national headlines, and the national attention, when it finally arrived, carried its own complicated weight, because it arrived late and unevenly, and the family of a 25-year-old graduate student had to fight for a level of public engagement that other cases generated automatically. Jelani Day was studying speech pathology at Illinois State University in Normal, Illinois, in the summer of 2021. He was 25 years old, a Danville native, a young man with a defined professional trajectory, pursuing a graduate degree in a field built around helping people communicate, moving toward a career as a doctor, and serving, in a particularly intimate and concrete way, as a bone marrow match for his father, who was ill. That last detail is the kind of biographical fact that resists abstraction. A son whose biology was the specific, irreplaceable answer to his father's illness. He was not simply a student. He was the person his father's survival depended on, in a way that no one else in the world could substitute for. He was enrolled in classes. He had a future laid out in a direction that was legible and purposeful and pointed somewhere good. And on August 24th, 2021, he was last seen on a campus in Bloomington, Illinois. And then he was not seen anywhere that anyone has been able to account for. And the next confirmed physical trace of him was in an entirely different city, in circumstances that have generated disputed interpretations ever since. The last known location placing Jelani Day in Bloomington on August 24th was the Beyond Hello cannabis dispensary. That detail is documented and confirmed by investigators. A specific business, a specific location, a last known point that anchors the beginning of the gap. He was there, and then he was not anywhere that anyone could find. His mother knew something was wrong the next morning, when her calls to him went unanswered. Jelani Day was not a person who went silent on his family. He was not a person whose mother would call and expect not to hear back. The silence that began after August 24th was immediately and recognizably wrong to the people who knew him best, and the formal missing persons report followed quickly, not 5 weeks later, not after a damaging delay, but promptly, with the urgency the situation demanded. Here's the critical detail that reframes the entire geography of this case. 2 days after Jelani was last seen in Bloomington, on August 26th, his car was found in Peru, Illinois, approximately 60 miles north of Bloomington, up a corridor of Central Illinois Highway that runs through farm country and small river towns toward the Illinois River Valley. Peru is an old river city in LaSalle County, sitting on the south bank of the Illinois River, where Route 251 crosses toward the water. Jelani Day had no documented connection to Peru. No reason to be there that has been established in the public record. No friend, no errand, no appointment, no trail of communications pointing toward that city or that stretch of the Illinois River. His car did not simply drift 60 miles north along the interstate it was driven or transported there. And the 60 miles between Bloomington and Peru represent a gap in the documented record of Jelani Day's final hours that has never been filled with verified information. But it is not just that the car was in Peru. It is how the car was in Peru. Investigators found it concealed in a wooded area, not parked on a street, not left in a lot, not sitting at a trailhead in the ordinary way a car sits when someone has gone for a walk. Concealed, in woods. That word carries weight in a missing persons investigation that a parked car on a residential street simply does not. A concealed car is a car that someone did not want found quickly. A concealed car represents a deliberate act of placement designed to delay the discovery of a physical piece of evidence. A concealed car in the woods near a river, belonging to a man who has no documented reason to be in that city and who has not been seen or heard from since the previous day, is not an ambiguous detail. It is the kind of detail that drives the entire investigative logic of what follows. The searches that Illinois State Police and LaSalle County investigators launched in response to the car's discovery were extensive dogs, drones, ground search and rescue teams combing the wooded and riverbank terrain around Peru over multiple days in late August and early September 2021. The Illinois River moves through that stretch of LaSalle County with the particular character of a large Midwestern waterway, wide, murky, slow in places, and deceptively fast in others, with a bottom that does not surrender what it takes in with any ease or reliability. Now this is where the case turns dark in the specific and contested way that has driven Jelani Day's family and supporters forward for years. A body was recovered from the Illinois River near Peru in early September 2021 and was subsequently identified as Jelani Day. The LaSalle County coroner determined the cause of death to be drowning. That determination and its implications were immediately and forcefully disputed by Jelani's mother, Carmen Bolden Day, who has maintained from the beginning that her son did not die by suicide, and that the circumstances of his death indicate foul play that has not been adequately investigated or acknowledged by authorities. She has pointed to the concealed car, to the distance from campus, to the absence of any documented reason for Jelani to be in Peru, to the clothing he was found without. He was missing items of clothing when his body was recovered, a detail that his family has cited as inconsistent with a drowning, as evidence that the official account does not fully account for what happened to her son. The dispute between Carmen Bolden Day and the official findings in her son's case is not a peripheral element of this story. It is the story, or at least, it is the layer of the story that gives the Jelani Day case its particular and persistent weight in the years since his body was recovered from the Illinois River. Because the coroner's ruling of drowning did not resolve the central questions that the physical evidence had already raised. It absorbed them. It placed an official label on a death without explaining the circumstances that preceded it: the 60 miles, the concealed car, the missing clothing, the absence of any documented reason for a 25-year-old graduate student from Bloomington to be in Peru, Illinois, in the woods beside a river he had no known connection to. The ruling established a cause of death. It did not establish how Jelani Day came to be in that river, or who, if anyone, was responsible for putting him there. Those two questions, the cause and the circumstances, are different questions, and the answer to one does not automatically supply the answer to the other. Carmen Bolden Day understood that distinction from the beginning, and she has refused to allow it to be collapsed into a single official determination that she believes is incomplete. The missing clothing deserves its own moment of attention, because it is the kind of physical detail that investigators and families both understand carries disproportionate significance. When Jelani Day's body was recovered from the Illinois River, he was found without certain items of clothing that he had been wearing when he was last seen. The specific nature of those missing items has been reported in coverage of the case, and the family has cited the absence as evidence that what happened to Jelani was not consistent with a voluntary entry into the water. The argument is straightforward in its logic. A person who enters water voluntarily, in whatever state of mind, does not typically arrive at the riverbank, having already been separated from clothing in a way that leaves the clothing unaccounted for in the surrounding area. The absence of those items from both the body and the immediate recovery area is something the family has pressed investigators to explain within the framework of the official drowning ruling. And it is something that has not been publicly resolved in a way that has satisfied them or closed the question for those who have followed the case closely. Carmen Bolden Day became, in the months and years following her son's death, one of the most visible and articulate advocates in the national conversation about the disparate treatment of missing and murdered Black Americans. She drew a direct and pointed comparison between the level of attention and resources directed toward Jelani's case and the attention generated almost simultaneously by the disappearance of Gabby Petito, a young white woman, whose case became a national media phenomenon in late August and September of 2021, the same weeks during which Jelani Day was missing and then found. The contrast was stark enough to be undeniable. Petito's disappearance generated wall-to-wall cable news coverage, viral social media engagement, and the kind of immediate, sustained public mobilization that produces tips and pressure and institutional response. Jelani Day's disappearance, occurring in the same news cycle, in the same country, involving a young man whose family was desperate for exactly the same kind of attention and engagement, received a fraction of that coverage in its early weeks. Carmen Bolden Day named that disparity publicly, clearly, and without hesitation, and the national conversation that followed about missing white woman syndrome, about which families receive the full weight of public and media attention when someone they love disappears, about whose grief is treated as a national story and whose is not, was a conversation that her advocacy helped force into the open. It was an important conversation. It was also a conversation that did not bring her son back, and did not produce the answers she was looking for about what happened to him in the 60 miles between Bloomington and Peru. Here's what doesn't make sense about the official account, laid out plainly. Jelani Day was last confirmed in Bloomington on August 24th. His car was found concealed in woods near Peru on August 26th, 2 days later, 60 miles away. His body was found in the Illinois River near Peru in early September. The coroner ruled drowning. Now work backward from those facts toward the questions they generate. How did Jelani Day get from Bloomington to Peru? He drove, or someone drove him, or he was transported, but the car's concealment suggests that whoever positioned it in those woods did not want it found immediately, which implies a deliberate action taken by a person aware that the car's location would be relevant to an investigation. Did Jelani conceal his own car in the woods before entering the river? That sequence of events is not impossible, but the family's argument, and the argument of those who believe the official ruling is incomplete, is that the concealment of the vehicle is more consistent with the actions of someone trying to delay the connection between a location and a crime than with the actions of a person in a mental health crisis walking into a river. Those are two different behavioral profiles, and the concealment of the car is, at minimum, a detail that complicates the simpler interpretation of the drowning ruling. The searches conducted in the days following the car's discovery were thorough in the way that searches in a river corridor can be thorough, which is to say, thorough within the significant limitations imposed by the Illinois River itself. Dogs worked the riverbank and the wooded terrain. Drones surveyed the area from above. Ground teams covered the accessible land between the tree line and the water. The river is not cooperative terrain for a search. It is wide and murky, and its current carries things, and the bottom is soft and unstable in ways that make underwater recovery genuinely difficult, even with modern equipment. The recovery of Jelani Day's body came weeks after the searches began, after the river had moved through the late August and early September period, and whatever the water knew had been held in that current for long enough that the family was forced to wait, not knowing, while investigators worked a landscape that gave back information on its own terms and timeline. Illinois State University, where Jelani was enrolled in the graduate speech pathology program, held vigils. His family organized searches. Community members in Bloomington and Normal, and in his hometown of Danville, showed up in the ways that communities show up when one of their own is missing, with presence, with effort, with the kind of collective refusal to accept silence that occasionally produces the tip or the witness or the piece of information that changes the trajectory of an investigation. Whether any of that community engagement produced investigative leads that have since been pursued is not known from the public record. What is known is that the leads, whatever they were, did not produce an arrest, a charge, or a public acknowledgement from investigators that the circumstances of Jelani Day's death are being treated as anything other than what the coroner's ruling established. The bone marrow detail stays with you. A son who was his father's biological match, the specific, irreplaceable answer to a specific, life-threatening illness, gone before that match could be realized in the full way it was meant to be. That is not a detail included here for its emotional weight alone, though it carries enormous emotional weight. It is included because it is part of who Jelani Day was, part of the specific shape of his life, and what it meant to the people inside it. Part of why the failure to fully account for what happened to him is not an abstraction, but a concrete and ongoing harm to real people who needed him to come home. a graduate student in speech pathology, studying how people communicate, whose own story has been shaped by a failure of the systems and structures that are supposed to communicate clearly about what happened and why. The irony is not subtle, it is not comfortable. It sits in the center of this case like a splinter that nothing has yet worked free. What you are left with, in the end, is a set of coordinates. A dispensary in Bloomington where he was last seen, a wooded area near Peru where his car was hidden, a river that returned his body weeks later. 60 miles between the first point and the second, with nothing documented in between. A cause of death that his mother does not accept. A national conversation about whose disappearances matter, sparked in part by a grieving woman who refused to let her son's case be absorbed quietly into a statistical category. And the Illinois River, moving through LaSalle County the way it always has, past Peru and Ottawa and the canal towns, carrying whatever it knows in a current that has not yet surrendered everything. A car tucked into the trees near a river he had no reason to be near. A mother who has not stopped asking what happened in those 60 miles. The case remains disputed and officially unresolved. The next one is worse, because the person who vanished was 6 years old, and the only witness to whatever happened was a woman who took that knowledge with her when she died, leaving behind a note designed, deliberately and precisely, to make sure the child was never found. Timothy Pitson was 6 years old on the morning of May 11th, 2011. He attended Greenman Elementary School in Aurora, Illinois, one of the collar county cities that ring Chicago to the west. A city large enough to have its own distinct geography, but still carrying the suburban character of the Fox River Valley it sits beside. Timothy was an only child. He was in kindergarten or first grade, at the age where school is still new enough to be an adventure, where the routine of morning drop-off and afternoon pickup is a daily rhythm that parents and children navigate together without drama, a small, ordinary contract between a family and an institution that both sides fulfill without thinking about it. On the morning of May 11th, his mother, Amy Fry Pitson, dropped him at school. And then, between 8:10 and 8:15 in the morning, she came back. She walked into Greenman Elementary and checked Timothy out of class. The reason she gave the school was a family emergency. The family emergency did not exist. Here's the critical detail that every account of this case returns to, because it is the fact around which everything else organizes itself. Amy Fry Pitson was Timothy's mother. She was not a stranger, not a threat in the legal or institutional sense. She was his parent. And parents checking children out of school is an ordinary enough occurrence that the school's response to her arrival was the response the system is designed to produce. Not a failure of vigilance, but an accurate reading of a situation that, on its surface, presented as unremarkable. A mother came for her child. The child left with his mother. That is what schools are designed to allow. Whatever was happening inside Amy Fry Pitson on that May morning, whatever had driven her to construct a false family emergency and remove her son from a school day that had barely begun, it was not visible on the surface of a routine checkout interaction, and the school had no mechanism to see past it. What followed Timothy's checkout from Greenman Elementary on the morning of May 11, 2011, was not chaos or immediate alarm. It was a road trip. That is the word that surfaces in every account of this case, and it is the word that makes this case unlike almost any other in this lineup, because the days immediately following the school checkout were not blank, not undocumented, not swallowed by the immediate silence that characterizes most disappearances. They were, instead, a documented journey. A mother and her 6-year-old son moving through a series of locations across the upper Midwest, leaving behind a trail of receipts and sightings and motel records that investigators were subsequently able to reconstruct with reasonable confidence. A trail that had a beginning and a middle and then, at a specific point in its geography, simply stopped producing the child. The trail continued with Amy Fry Pitson. It did not continue with Timothy. And the gap between the last confirmed sighting of the two of them together and the point at which Amy Fry Pitson was found alone is the gap that has driven this case through more than a decade of searches, tips, and anguished uncertainty. The route, as investigators reconstructed it, moved northeast from Aurora. From Greenman Elementary, Amy took Timothy to the Brookfield Zoo in the western suburbs of Chicago, one of the largest and most visited zoos in the country. A place that on a weekday morning in May would have been populated enough to make two people moving through it unremarkable. A mother and a young boy at the zoo. Whatever that day looked like for Timothy, whether it felt like an adventure, a treat, an unexpected gift of a school day repurposed into something exciting, it is impossible to know. He was 6 years old. He was with his mother. From Brookfield Zoo, the route continued north to a water park in Gurnee, Illinois, near the Wisconsin border. Again, a child at a water park, a May afternoon. A mother who was, at least in the visible outward shape of these stops, doing the things that parents do with young children on an unplanned day together. Rides and animals and water, and the particular exhausted happiness of a small child who has been given too much stimulation in a single day. Whatever Amy Fry Pitson was carrying internally on that journey, whatever was driving the decision to remove her son from school and take him on this particular route through these particular places, it was not visible in the surface of the stops themselves. From Gurnee, the route crossed into Wisconsin to the Wisconsin Dells, a resort area north of Madison built around water parks and family entertainment. The kind of destination that makes complete sense as a stop on a trip designed around keeping a 6-year-old occupied and happy. They stayed the night. The morning of May 13th, Timothy and his mother were seen checking out of the resort together. That checkout, documented, confirmed, is the last confirmed moment that any independent witness or institutional record places Timothy Pitson in the presence of his mother, alive and physically present. After that checkout, the road trip continued south, back toward Illinois. And somewhere on that southward leg, the road trip changed its character entirely. Because when Amy Fry Pitson checked into a motel in Rockford, Illinois, that night, the night of May 13th, she appeared to be alone. Timothy was not seen at the Rockford motel. He was not seen checking in. He was not seen at any location between the Wisconsin Dells resort checkout on the morning of May 13th and the Rockford motel that evening. In the hours between those 2 points, in whatever stretch of Illinois highway or off-highway geography Amy Fry Pitson passed through on her way from Wisconsin to Rockford, Timothy disappeared from the documented record of the journey. Here's the critical detail about how the case entered the official record. Amy Fry Pitson was found dead at the Rockford motel the following morning. She had died by suicide. She left a note. The note said that Timothy was safe, that he was being cared for, that he was with people who would love him, and that he would never be found. Read that again slowly, because it is the sentence that has sat at the center of this case for more than a decade. Not that she didn't know where he was, not that she was uncertain about his fate. She wrote that he would never be found. She wrote it as a statement of intent, a promise, or a threat, depending on how you read it, designed to do exactly what it has done, which is to foreclose the resolution of this case by removing the one person who knew where Timothy was. Whatever arrangement she had made for her son in the hours between the Wisconsin Dells checkout and the Rockford motel, whoever she had left him with, wherever she had placed him, under whatever circumstances she had transferred him from her custody into someone else's, she carried that knowledge into the motel room in Rockford and did not leave it behind in any form that investigators could use. This is where it stops being normal in the most agonizing possible sense, because the note changed the nature of the investigation in a way that almost no other piece of evidence in a missing child case does. In most missing child cases, investigators are working against uncertainty. The child could be anywhere, with anyone, for any reason, and the absence of information is the primary obstacle. The note in Timothy's case removed some of that uncertainty and replaced it with something arguably worse. Amy Fry Pitson knew where her son was. She chose not to write it down. She chose, in the final hours of her life, to preserve that information as a private possession rather than leave it behind for the people who would spend years looking for her child. Whether that decision reflects the depth of whatever she was experiencing in those final days, whether it reflects a belief that Timothy was truly safe and better off undiscovered, whether it reflects something darker and more deliberate, those interpretations are available, and none of them leads to Timothy. The physical evidence added its own layer of dread to an already devastating picture. When investigators examined Amy Fry Pitson's SUV, they found Timothy's blood. The discovery of blood in the vehicle was reported publicly and has never been explained in any way that resolves what it means for Timothy's well-being. It is listed here as a fact, confirmed, documented, and its implications are genuinely unknown. Blood in a vehicle can represent a range of circumstances, from minor injury to something far more serious, and investigators have not publicly disclosed findings that place it definitively in one category or the other. What it does, with certainty, is complicate the note's assurance that Timothy was safe. A note that promises a child's safety and a vehicle that contains that child's blood do not point comfortably in the same direction. They introduce a tension that has never been resolved, that sits in the case file as an unanswered question of the most fundamental kind. Is Timothy Pitson alive? The searches that followed the discovery of Amy's body and the note were extensive and sustained. The Sterling and Rock Falls area in northwestern Illinois received particular investigative attention: searches of the terrain, searches of properties, interviews with anyone who might have seen a mother and a young boy at any point along the reconstructed route. The documented stops at Brookfield Zoo and the Gurney Water Park and the Wisconsin Dells Resort were reviewed for surveillance footage and witness accounts that might add detail to the picture of those days. The motel in Rockford was processed. Tips flooded in from across the country. The volume of public response to a missing child case is, in general, significantly higher than the volume generated by cases involving adults. And Timothy's case generated thousands of contacts that investigators worked through over months and years. None of them produced a confirmed sighting. None of them led to a location. None of them identified the person or persons Amy Fry Pitson's note suggested were caring for her son. Now this is where the case turns dark in a way that extends across years. In 2019, 8 years after Timothy Pitson disappeared, a young man appeared in Newport, Kentucky, and told authorities that he was Timothy, that he had escaped from traffickers and needed help. The claim generated immediate and intense national attention. Law enforcement responded. DNA testing was conducted. The young man was not Timothy Pitson. He was identified as a 23-year-old adult male, and he was subsequently charged with making a false report. The episode was devastating in a specific and particular way for Timothy's family, not only because it raised and then crushed hope with clinical efficiency, but because it illustrated the ongoing vulnerability of this case to exploitation, to the hoaxes and false claims that accumulate around high-profile missing child cases over the years, as the public profile of the case fades and resurges in unpredictable cycles. Timothy's family has lived with that vulnerability for more than a decade. Every claim, every tip, every reported sighting has to be taken seriously enough to investigate and carries the potential to inflict the particular cruelty of hope that doesn't survive contact with evidence. The age progression images of Timothy Pitson show a young man, now a face built by forensic artists, from photographs of a 6-year-old boy and from the biological features of his parents, an educated projection of what time and genetics might have produced. Those images exist because the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the investigators working this case have refused to close it, have continued to update the visual record of what Timothy might look like in the hope that someone, somewhere, will recognize a face that has been changing every year since 2011. Timothy Pitson would be around 20 years old now. If the note was telling the truth, if he was left with someone who loved him, if he is alive somewhere in the world, he is old enough to have his own memories of those days, his own understanding of who he is and where he came from, his own ability to seek help if he wants to find his family. Whether he knows his own name, whether he knows he is being looked for, whether the people he was left with have told him the truth about where he came from, none of that is known. None of it can be known until Timothy is found, or until Timothy finds his way back. The note promised he would never be found. The investigation has refused to honor that promise. Those two facts have been in tension for more than 13 years, and the tension has not yet resolved in either direction. An age-progressed face on a poster, a note that promised silence. A documented route that ends in the hours between a Wisconsin resort checkout and a Rockford motel, in a stretch of Illinois geography that has not yet given back what it knows. The case is open. Timothy Pitson has not been found. And the next one is worse, because the person who vanished was 13 years old, and she vanished not from a road or a river or a highway shoulder. She vanished from inside her own bedroom, on a sick day, in a suburb that looked exactly like every other suburb in Will County. And the question of whether she ever left that house at all has never been answered in any way that investigators have been able to act on. Bolingbrook, Illinois, January 31st, 1996. It was a Wednesday. Snow was on the ground and the temperature was the kind of cold that makes a sick day feel like the only reasonable place to be wrapped in blankets, not going anywhere. The ordinary small mercy of a winter illness that keeps you home from school and in bed with a sore throat, while the world outside continues its business without you. Rachel Mellon was 13 years old. She had stayed home sick. Her mother had gone to work because the morning had presented itself as a sick child at home situation rather than a crisis. The kind of thing that parents navigate constantly, a child with a manageable illness, old enough to be home alone for a few hours, and a workday that couldn't easily be rearranged. Rachel was not alone in the technical sense. Her stepfather, Vince Mellon, was home. He was unemployed at the time, which meant that the house on that January Wednesday contained two people, a sick 13-year-old and the man her mother had married, and that the hours between Rachel's mother leaving for work and her return that evening belonged, in their entirety, to whatever happened inside that house, while the snow sat cold and still on the ground outside. Rachel Mellon's mother came home from work that evening, in the ordinary way that parents come home, not braced for disaster, not carrying premonition, moving through the transition from workday to home with the kind of unremarkable forward momentum that defines the end of an ordinary Wednesday. She went to get Rachel for dinner. The room where Rachel had been resting, where she had been sick and staying warm on a January day cold enough to keep any sensible 13-year-old inside, was empty. Not disturbed in any dramatic way that announced itself immediately as wrong, just empty. Rachel was not in her bed. She was not in the house. The mother who had left that morning with a sick daughter at home came back in the evening to a house that no longer contained her daughter. And the explanation she received from Vince Mellon was the explanation that would define and drive and ultimately frustrate the investigation that followed. He said the dog had gotten out. He had gone after the dog. When he came back, Rachel was gone. That was the account. The dog got out. He left. She was gone when he returned. The window of Vince Mellon's absence, chasing a dog through a cold January neighborhood in Bolingbrook, was the window into which Rachel Mellon's disappearance was placed, and it was a window that investigators have spent more than 2 decades trying to either confirm or collapse, without yet achieving either. Here's the critical detail that makes the dog walk account so difficult to accept as a complete explanation. Rachel Mellon, if she left that house voluntarily on January 31st, 1996, left in the middle of a cold Illinois winter, wearing almost nothing suited to the outdoors. The clothing she is believed to have had with her if she left at all was the clothing of a sick person spending a day in bed, slippers, sweatpants, or a similar casual garment. A blue blanket, which some accounts suggest she may have taken with her. Not a coat, not boots. Not the practical layering that anyone with functional judgment about a January afternoon in northern Illinois would consider the absolute minimum before stepping outside. She had a sore throat. She had been homesick. The gap between the clothing she had available and the clothing you would need to willingly step out into a freezing Will County afternoon and go somewhere anywhere is not a small gap. It is the kind of gap that, when you look at it directly, resists every innocent interpretation. A sick 13-year-old does not walk out of a warm house into January in slippers unless something has gone catastrophically wrong, either with her decision-making in a moment of acute distress or with the circumstances inside the house that she was leaving. This is where it stops being normal in the institutional sense, and where the institutional failure becomes its own layer of the story. For 2 full days after Rachel Mellon was reported missing, police in Bolingbrook treated her disappearance as a runaway case, not a missing child emergency, not a situation requiring immediate, intensive investigation of the home and the last person to see her. A runaway. A 13-year-old girl who had, in the official framing, decided on a sick winter Wednesday to leave her house and not come back. That framing persisted for 48 hours during which the ground outside held snow, during which any footprints or physical evidence in the immediate vicinity of the house was subject to weather and time and the ordinary degradation that outdoor evidence undergoes when no one is treating the location as a crime scene. 2 days during which the last adult to see Rachel alive was not being interviewed as a suspect in a potential crime, but as a concerned family member in a runaway situation. 2 days during which the investigation was oriented in entirely the wrong direction, asking questions designed to find a teenager who had left voluntarily, rather than questions designed to determine whether a teenager had been harmed inside a house by a person who was still living in that house. The runaway framing was not unique to this case. It is a recurring institutional failure in missing child cases, particularly involving teenage girls, particularly when the last known adult contact is a family member rather than a stranger, particularly when the initial presentation of events includes an account of voluntary departure, however implausible. The system is designed, in its default mode, to look for a child who left rather than a child who was taken, and shifting that default requires either physical evidence of harm or a rapid escalation of concern from investigators who are paying close enough attention to the circumstances to recognize when the voluntary departure narrative does not hold. In Rachel Mellon's case, the slippers, the winter, the sick day, and the dog walk account together formed a set of circumstances that, to anyone looking carefully, should have escalated the investigation within hours. It took 2 days. By the time investigators began treating Rachel's disappearance with the urgency it required, the trail was already 2 days colder than it should have been. Now this is where the case turns dark in the specific way that long cold cases do when new investigative tools arrive and are applied to old facts. In the year 2000, 4 years after Rachel Mellon disappeared from her home on that January afternoon, police held Vince Mellon for approximately 9 hours of questioning. A search warrant was executed for biological samples, blood, saliva, and hair. The warrant itself represents a significant investigative statement. You do not obtain a warrant for biological samples from a person in a missing persons case unless investigators have reached a level of suspicion sufficient to justify the legal standard required for that warrant, and unless they believe that biological evidence from that person might be relevant to establishing what happened to the missing individual. The warrant was executed. The samples were taken. Investigators at the time referred to the inquiry as part of a first-degree murder investigation, a formal acknowledgement that Rachel Mellon was not being treated, at that point in 2000, as a runaway who might still be alive somewhere. She was being treated as a homicide victim. Vince Mellon was being treated as a person of interest in that homicide. What the biological samples produced, what the 9-hour interview disclosed, what investigative steps followed from the 2000 warrant? Those details have not been publicly released in any form that has entered the accessible record. No charges were filed. No arrest was made. Vince Mellon was not charged in connection with Rachel's disappearance. The investigation continued. The case remained open. There is a detail in the public record about the snow that deserves its own quiet moment. January 31st, 1996. In Bolingbrook, Illinois. Snow on the ground. The yard around the house, the sidewalk, the street, all of it subject to the particular characteristic of fresh snow, which is that it records movement. Footprints in snow are not subtle. They are not ambiguous. A person walking out of a house and into a snowy yard leaves evidence of that departure in a form that is immediately readable and directionally specific. You can see where the footprints go, whether they cross the yard, whether they reach the street, whether they turn one way or another. If Rachel Mellon walked out of that house in slippers on January 31st, 1996, the snow should have recorded it. The publicly available record does not include a confirmed account of what investigators found or did not find in the snow around that house. And the 2-day delay before the case was treated as anything other than a runaway means that whatever the snow might have preserved on January 31st had 2 days of additional weather and foot traffic to contend with before anyone was looking at it with forensic intent. What the snow held and what it gave up is officially unknown. What has been publicly referenced in later coverage of the case is the suggestion that undisclosed technical advances in forensic investigation have provided investigators with new avenues to pursue. That language, technical advances, new avenues, is the language of a case that has not been abandoned, that is being actively maintained and periodically revisited with new tools applied to old evidence. but that has not yet produced the publicly actionable result that would justify a more specific disclosure. It is the language, in other words, of a case that is going somewhere very slowly, in the particular way that forensic science has enabled cold cases to move in the decades since DNA analysis and related technologies transformed what old evidence can yield. Whether those technical advances will eventually produce a charge, a conviction, a resolution that is genuinely unknown, the case is officially open. Rachel Mellon has never been found. A sick day, a dog that got out, a blue blanket and a pair of slippers, snow that should have recorded everything and was given 2 days to forget it. Those are the objects and the circumstances that define this case in the public record, not a crime scene photograph, not a confession, not a body recovered from a location that provided a final answer. Just the shape of an absence, and the snow, and the January silence of a suburban street in Will County that has not yet said what it knows. The case is open. Rachel Mellon has not been found. And the last case is the worst, because it wasn't one child who vanished, it was 2 sisters from the same apartment on the same morning. And the largest systematic search in Chicago's modern history searched more than 5,000 abandoned buildings across the South Side and found nothing. Not a trace, not a thread, not a single piece of physical evidence that has been publicly confirmed as connecting to what happened to Diamond and Tionda Bradley on the morning of July 6, 2001, in the Bronzeville neighborhood of Chicago's South Side. Diamond Bradley was 3 years old. Tionda Bradley was 10. They were sisters, living with their mother in a 3rd-floor apartment near the corner of 35th Street and Cottage Grove Avenue in Bronzeville, a neighborhood with deep historical roots in Black Chicago, a community that had seen decades of migration and transformation and carried within it both the richness of that history and the economic pressures that had reshaped the South Side across the latter half of the 20th century. The apartment building was a specific, physical place, 3rd floor, a specific address, a specific set of stairs and hallways, and a back porch that would become central to the investigation's early hours. The girls lived there with their mother, who worked. On the morning of July 6th, she left for work at approximately 6 a.m., leaving Tionda and Diamond in the apartment. Tionda was 10 years old enough, in the practical calculus of a working mother with limited options, to be responsible for herself and her 3-year-old sister for a few hours on a July morning. It was a decision made under the particular pressures of being a single working parent in an urban environment, and it was a decision that did not survive the morning it was made in any form that produced a good outcome. When the girl's mother returned home approximately 5 hours later, the apartment was empty. Tionda and Diamond were not there. She found a note. The note was on the back porch, handwritten, in the kind of phrasing that a 10-year-old might plausibly produce, explaining that the girls had gone to a nearby store and to a park or school playground. The note identified specific locations that Tionda knew: a store, a school, the kind of practical geography that a 10-year-old navigates in a known neighborhood. On its surface, the note presented a picture of 2 girls who had made a decision to go outside together, who had communicated that decision in writing, and who had not yet returned when their mother arrived home. It was the kind of note that, in a different set of circumstances, might have been followed by the sound of 2 children coming up the stairs 5 minutes later, breathless and summer sweaty and entirely fine. They did not come up the stairs. They were not at the store. They were not at the playground. The note on the back porch became, almost immediately, the most contested piece of evidence in a case that generated more investigative activity than almost any missing children case in Chicago's history. Not because its existence was disputed, the note was there, it was found, it was examined, but because the people who knew Tionda Bradley best looked at that note and heard something wrong in it. The family's position, stated publicly and consistently across the years since 2001, is that the language in the note was not Tionda's language, that the phrasing, the grammar, the particular construction of the sentences, the way ideas were assembled and expressed, did not match the voice of a 10-year-old girl that her family knew intimately. They believed, and have continued to believe, that someone who knew Tionda was involved in what happened that morning, that the note was written under duress, or was written in a way guided or dictated by another person, or was in some other way a product of circumstances that the note itself was designed to conceal rather than reveal. The note was meant to look like an explanation. The family believed it was a performance of an explanation, crafted to buy time, to redirect attention, to move the initial response away from the apartment and toward a set of outdoor locations that would absorb the first hours of the search in entirely the wrong direction. Here's the critical detail about Tionda that the family returned to repeatedly in their public statements about the note. Tionda Bradley was described by those who knew her as a shy child, particularly shy with strangers. She was careful with people she did not know. She was not a child who would readily go somewhere with someone she had not been introduced to within the circle of people she trusted. She loved to dance. She ran track. She was, in the particular way that 10-year-olds are, a fully formed person with preferences and aversions and a known social geography, a set of people she was comfortable with, and a wariness toward those outside that set. That wariness is important because it shapes the interpretation of what might have happened on the morning of July 6th. If Tionda did not readily go with strangers, then the person or people who took her and Diamond, if they were taken, were almost certainly not strangers. They were someone Tionda knew. Someone who appeared in the doorway of that third-floor apartment on a July morning, or who was already known to the family well enough that Tionda's caution did not engage, that the ordinary alarm she would have felt about an unfamiliar adult did not fire in the way it might have with someone truly unknown. The search that followed the girl's disappearance was staggering in its scale. Investigators, community volunteers, and law enforcement personnel searched more than 5,000 abandoned buildings across Chicago's South Side. 5,000. That number is not a rhetorical flourish, it is a documented operational fact, a measure of the systematic and exhausting effort that was made to find two children in the dense, complex urban landscape of a city that, in 2001, had no shortage of structures that had been emptied by decades of disinvestment and decay. The South Side of Chicago contains within it an enormous amount of built space that has been vacated apartment buildings, storefronts, industrial structures, the architectural residue of a city that contracted in certain neighborhoods while expanding in others, leaving behind a landscape of hollow structures that could, theoretically, conceal almost anything. Investigators went through 5,000 of them. They found nothing that has been publicly confirmed as connected to Diamond and Tionda Bradley. Not a piece of clothing, not a personal item, not a physical trace of any kind that has entered the accessible record as evidence in this case. This is where it stops being normal in the way that large-scale searches sometimes do, when the sheer volume of effort begins to feel less like a path to resolution and more like a demonstration of how completely two people can disappear from a city that contains millions of witnesses. Chicago is not rural Illinois. It is not a highway shoulder or a canal trail or a river town with 4 miles of dark road between one point and the next. It is one of the most densely populated cities in the United States. A city of traffic and transit and cameras and foot traffic and the continuous human density that, in theory, makes disappearance harder and discovery more likely. 2 children vanished from a third-floor apartment in a dense South Side neighborhood in the middle of a summer morning, and the city that surrounded them, all of its density and movement and human presence, gave up nothing. Not a confirmed sighting from anyone who saw where they went after leaving that building. Not a witness who observed 2 girls, one 3 years old and one 10, moving through the streets of Bronzeville on a July morning and thought to record or report it. The neighborhood that contained them on the morning of July 6th has not, in 23 years, produced anyone who has been confirmed as having seen them after they left that apartment. Now this is where the case turns dark in the particular way that cases involving disputed evidence do, when the central physical artifact of the case is simultaneously the most important thing investigators have and the thing least trusted by the people closest to the victims. The note sat in evidence. Investigators examined it. Handwriting analysis was conducted. The question of whether the note represented Tionda's authentic, uncoerced voice or something else, something produced under circumstances that the note itself was designed to obscure, was a question that forensic examination could address only partially and inconclusively. Handwriting analysis can establish whether a specific person wrote a specific document. It is considerably less equipped to establish whether that person wrote it freely or under duress, whether the words on the page are the writer's own or words supplied by someone else and copied down. The gap between what the note could prove and what the family believed it demonstrated has never been bridged by any publicly disclosed forensic finding. The note exists. What it means about what happened on the morning of July 6th remains, in the most critical sense, officially unknown. The years following the girl's disappearance were punctuated by the particular cruelty that accumulates around high-profile missing children cases over time. False sightings, false claims, individuals who contacted the family or authorities with information that, upon investigation, dissolved into nothing. Multiple people came forward across the years claiming knowledge of the girl's whereabouts or fate. None of those claims survived investigative scrutiny in any form that has been publicly confirmed. Each one required response, investigation, the expenditure of investigative resources that were finite, and the particular emotional toll on a family that has never been able to afford the luxury of dismissing any claim outright, because the alternative, dismissing something real, is worse than the cost of pursuing something false. That is the ongoing tax that unresolved cases impose on the families at their center. The case never closed, so the door never closed. And every person who walked through that door with a claim required the family and investigators to take it seriously enough to determine, once again, that it led nowhere. Age progression images of Diamond and Tionda Bradley have been updated across the years by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Those images show what the two girls might look like as adult women. Diamond, who was 3 years old in 2001, would be approximately 27 now. Tionda, who was 10, would be approximately 33. They were children when they disappeared. They are not children in the age progression images. The technology that produces those images is built on the biological logic of how human faces change across time, how the features of a 3-year-old become the features of a young woman, how the face of a 10-year-old develops across the years into something recognizably connected to what it was, while also being entirely transformed. Those images are published and circulated in the hope that someone, somewhere, will look at one of them and recognize a living person. That hope has not been extinguished. The case remains open. Diamond and Tionda Bradley have not been found. What does it mean that 5,000 buildings were searched and nothing was found? It means one of several things, none of them comforting. It means the girls were not in those buildings. It means they were moved beyond the search perimeter before it was established. It means they were taken somewhere outside the immediate geographic scope of the search, possibly outside Chicago, possibly outside Illinois, possibly at a distance from Bronzeville that the initial search parameters never reached. Or it means something darker, that whatever happened to them happened in a way that left nothing to find. The search of 5,000 buildings was not a failure of effort. It was a success of effort that produced a specific and terrible result: the confirmation that 2 children were not anywhere within the reach of one of the most extensive urban searches in the city's modern history. That confirmation, in its own way, tells a story. It just doesn't tell the whole story. And the whole story where Diamond and Tionda Bradley are, what happened to them on the morning of July 6th, 2001, who left that apartment building with 2 young children and never brought them back, remains officially unknown, 23 years after a handwritten note was found on a back porch in Bronzeville. The family has never stopped. Their mother has spoken publicly about the girls across the years, has worked to keep the case in public awareness, has engaged with every credible lead and endured every false one, and has maintained the particular kind of active, sustained grief that characterizes parents of missing children who have refused to accept the silence as an answer. The investigators who have worked this case have not closed it. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has not closed it. The age progression images keep being updated because the people responsible for finding Diamond and Tionda Bradley have not given up on the possibility that finding them is still something that can happen, that somewhere in the world, in a face that someone sees every day, is the answer to a question that has been open since the summer of 2001. A handwritten note on a back porch, 2 age-progressed faces of women who were last seen as children, 5,000 empty buildings that gave nothing back, and a Bronzeville corner in July where a morning began ordinarily and ended in a silence that has lasted more than 2 decades. The case is open. The next part closes the map, and most of the pins are still lit. Pull the map back out. The one from the beginning, Illinois at dusk, the cornfields and the river towns and the porch lights and the interstate shoulders. Put 10 pins in it and look at what you have. A subdivision in Bolingbrook where a mother of 2 was last heard from at 10:15 on a Sunday morning and has not been confirmed anywhere since. A garage in Plainfield where a car sat undisturbed while its owner was already gone. A phone already dark. A purse already silent. A stretch of the Fox River in Kane County where a canary yellow Toyota Celica spent 42 years on the riverbed, passed over once by the people who were looking for it. An interstate shoulder near mile marker 83 in LaSalle County where a Pontiac was ticketed and towed on a bright August afternoon, while the woman who had been driving it was already 500 miles away from where she would eventually be found. A rural road in Beecher where a woman in a black leather jacket was last seen at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and whose red hatchback surfaced 35 miles north in a different county with no explanation attached to its relocation. A canal trail between Marseilles and Seneca where a 4-mile walk on a September night simply ended and didn't end at a door and wasn't reported for 5 weeks. A wooded area near the Illinois River in Peru where a graduate student's car was found concealed 2 days after he was last seen in Bloomington, 60 miles south, for reasons that have never been established. A Wisconsin resort checkout on the morning of May 13, 2011, after which a 6-year-old boy named Timothy was not seen again, and a note left in a Rockford motel that promised he never would be. A snow-covered street in Bolingbrook where a sick 13-year-old in slippers either left a house in January or never left it at all, and where the snow that should have recorded the answer was given 2 days to forget it. And a back porch in Bronzeville, Chicago, where a handwritten note was found on a July morning in 2001, and 2 young girls, 3 years old and 10, were not behind it. 10 pins, most of them still open. Here is what the map shows you when you look at it honestly, without the expectation that a documentary about cold cases is supposed to deliver resolution, supposed to build toward a revelation that makes the preceding darkness feel purposeful and contained. The map shows you that Illinois is not a single kind of place. It is a highway and a river and a suburb and a city and a canal trail and a rural road and a motel room in Rockford and a 3rd-floor apartment in Bronzeville. It is every kind of Illinois geography, and in every one of those geographies, on an ordinary day, in the middle of ordinary life, something happened that the people responsible for resolving it have not yet been able to fully explain, charge, or close. The cases span from 1983 to 2021, nearly 4 decades of disappearances that include a woman in her 20s celebrating a promotion, a college student driving back to school, a graduate student heading to class, a suburban mother on a Sunday errand, another suburban mother with a gym bag and a garage full of her own car, a woman walking 4 miles home, a 6-year-old boy on a road trip with his mother, a 13-year-old on a sick day, and 2 sisters left alone on a July morning. Different ages, different decades, different geographies, the same absence at the end. Here's what doesn't make sense, or rather, here is the thing that these cases force you to confront when you hold all 10 of them together. In almost every one of these cases, there was a moment, a specific, identifiable moment, when the outcome might have been different if something had responded differently. If a reporting delay of 5 weeks had been 5 hours instead. If a runaway framing had been a missing child emergency from the first hour instead of the second day. If a car identified in a river in 2022 had been correctly identified rather than misidentified and passed over. If the institutional machinery that is supposed to catch people when they fall from ordinary life had been faster, more attuned, less susceptible to the assumptions and biases and resource limitations that shape every real-world investigation in ways that case files and news reports only partially reveal. The cases in this lineup are not all equivalent in what went wrong and when, but most of them contain, somewhere in their documented history, a moment when the gap between what happened and what might have happened narrowed to something that feels, in retrospect, almost unbearably thin. The cases that have produced some measure of physical resolution, and it is worth being precise about what resolution means here, because the word carries a weight it doesn't always deserve in this context, are few. Tammy Zywicki's body was found in Missouri 9 days after her car was ticketed on Interstate 80. That is a resolution in the forensic sense. Her fate was determined. A cause of death was established. Her family was not left in the permanent uncertainty of not knowing whether she was alive somewhere. But the person responsible for her death has never been charged, never arrested, never publicly identified as anything more than a suspect profile built from interstate witness accounts and a DNA sample that has not yet found its match in 30 years of database comparisons. The case is resolved in one dimension and entirely unresolved in the one that matters most to justice. Karen Scheepers's car came up from the Fox River in 2025, a physical discovery that transformed a 42-year absence of evidence into a confirmed location, a confirmed vehicle, a confirmed piece of the geography of what happened to her. But Karen Scheepers herself has not been found, and the question of how her car entered that river and whether someone put it there deliberately remains under active investigation. Jelani Day's body was recovered from the Illinois River, and a cause of death was formally determined. His mother does not accept that determination as a complete account of what happened to her son. The gap between the official ruling and the family's understanding of events has not been closed by anything that has entered the public record. Now this is where the map becomes something other than a collection of individual tragedies and starts to feel like a single, continuous argument about something larger. The Illinois cases in this lineup are not connected by a perpetrator, not linked by a method, not explained by a single theory about what kind of darkness produces a disappearance in a place like this. They are connected by geography and by the particular character of Illinois as a physical place, a state that contains within it every kind of terrain and every kind of community, from the dense urban grid of Chicago's South Side to the flat agricultural expanse of the Interstate corridor, to the Fox River Valley, to the Illinois River towns, to the Will County subdivisions, where quiet streets and two-car garages and school pickup routines create a surface of ordinary life so consistent and unremarkable that the disappearance of a person from within it registers first as impossible before it registers as real. Illinois is a state where you can vanish on a busy highway in broad daylight and not be found for 9 days, where you can vanish from a subdivision without leaving a single financial trace and not be charged for nearly 2 decades, where a car can sit in a river for 42 years and be looked at once and not recognized for what it was. The terrain does not protect people. The institutions do not always respond in time. The ordinary rhythms of daily life are not a guarantee of anything except that when they are interrupted, the interruption can be invisible for long enough to matter. The families in this lineup have not been passive. Cassandra Kales has spent nearly 2 decades pushing for answers in her sister Stacy's case. Carmen Bolden Day has built a national advocacy platform from her grief and her refusal to accept a ruling she believes is incomplete. The Zywicki family has maintained pressure on an unsolved highway murder for 30 years. Karen Scheepers's family recorded the specific details of her clothing and her watch and her car for 4 decades, refusing to let the particularity of who she was dissolve into a cold case statistic. The Bradleys' mother has spoken publicly about her daughters across 23 years of an open investigation. Rachel Mellon's family has waded through a 2000 murder investigation that produced no charges and has continued to wait through whatever the undisclosed technical advances have since produced. Timothy Pittson's father and extended family have endured the Kentucky hoax and the years of tips and the age progression images and the ongoing, unresolved question of whether a boy who would now be a young man is alive somewhere in the world, knowing or not knowing that people are still looking for him. These families are not defined by their cases, but their cases have defined enormous portions of their lives, the holidays and the anniversaries and the ordinary days when a phone ringing brings a moment of held breath before reality settles back in, and the call is something else, and the answer is still not there. What the map cannot show you, what no map can show you, is the interior of the absence, the specific weight of not knowing, the particular exhaustion of a family that has been waiting for a resolution long enough that the waiting has become its own kind of permanent condition. A low-grade ongoing crisis that coexists with grocery shopping and school runs and ordinary Wednesday afternoons in a way that people outside it find difficult to fully imagine. The cases in this lineup are documented facts, investigated events, open files in police departments and state agencies across Illinois. They are also the ongoing daily reality of the people who love the missing, who have been living inside the absence for years and decades, while the rest of the world has moved on and moved forward and largely forgotten. The files stay open. The families stay inside them. 10 cases, a handful of partial answers, most of the hardest questions still unanswered. A yellow car that spent 42 years in a river. A note that promised a child would never be found. A red hatchback 35 miles from where its driver was last seen. A phone that went straight to voicemail on a Sunday afternoon and has been silent for 17 years. A canal trail between two river towns that has not given back what it took on a September night in 2010. The map is still open. So are the cases. If you've stayed with all 10 of these, subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to know these names, and we'll see you on the next one.